Conclure cette quatrième session, pour conclure ce colloque, j'ai le plaisir, l'immense plaisir d'accueillir Karen Milbourne, docteur Karen Milbourne, qui est conservatrice au National Museum of African Art, Smithsonian Institution à Washington, D.C., depuis mai 2008. Auparavant, elle était conservatrice associée de l'art africain et chef du département des arts de l'Afrique, des Amériques, de l'Asie et des îles du Pacifique au Baltimore Museum of Art, Baltimore, Maryland. Et avant cela, professeure adjointe d'histoire de l'art à l'Université du Kentucky à Lexington. Son expertise comprend les arts et la parade de la Zambie occidentale et l'art africain contemporain. Depuis qu'elle a rejoint le National Museum of African Art, elle a été commissaire de nombreuses expositions comme Artist in Dialogue en 2009-2012, A Brave New World en 2010, Market Symphony d'Emeka Ogbo en 2016. Elle a co-organisé Senses of Time, vidéo et film-based Art of Africa, avec le docteur Polly Roberts de l'ACMA et UCLA, et l'exposition primée Visionary Perspectives on Africa's Art en 2017 au National Museum of African Art. Son exposition I Am, Contemporary Woman Artist of Africa, a ouvert le 20 juin 2019 et est accompagnée d'une publication. Karen Milbourne a obtenu son doctorat en histoire de l'art de l'Université de l'AUA en 2003 et a reçu de nombreux prix et bourses, notamment une prestigieuse bourse Fulbright et un prix Smithsonian Secretary for Excellence et le Smithsonian Secretary's Research Prize. Ses publications apparaissent dans de nombreux ouvrages et revues tels que African Arts, NK Journal of Contemporary African Arts, Art Papers, ARS et Collections. Elle fut présidente du Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowships. Chère Karen, je vous cède avec grand plaisir la parole. Nous sommes toutes oui.
Thank you so very much. It's such an honor to be here today, and I'd like to, give particular thanks to Rose and Anais and Camille and everyone at Aware for not just this conference, but for all of your efforts. And to say in particular, thank you to everyone who has come before me, not just over the past 4 days, but over the past decades and centuries, because it's on their footsteps that I walk. So I do usually, when I speak, actually speak extemporaneously, but because of the translation, I'm going to speak a little bit more on a script than I might ordinarily, and we'll see if I manage to stick to it. But thank you all for being here today. So we all have stories that we tell ourselves. These are the narratives we create to shape who we are as individuals, communities, and nations. Institutions play a role in the shaping of these narratives, but not all institutions are the same. I cannot know for sure what image comes to your mind when you think of an institution, if it's a university campus, government building, museum, or something else altogether. But as Pierre Bourdieu has argued in relation to the art world, perception of what gets considered art extends beyond the relationship between an object and its aesthetics. It also includes concepts of value, classification, and socio-political influence. He describes a field of cultural production with a shared language in which the, quote, the subject of the production of the artwork, of its value, also of its meaning, is not the producer who actually creates the objects in its materiality, but rather the entire set of agents engaged in the field, end quote. So today I'm really going to look at how art world institutions like museums produce such visions of who is an artist and what is an artwork. But the narratives formed within museums, galleries, and other platforms promote, undermine, move, and institutionalize existing gendered, racial, ethnic, class, and generational power differentials. So within the art world, there are multiple types of institutions. There are those founded on empire building, like the British Museum, as we see here. But we must also remember that this is not the only kind of model. The Center for Contemporary Art in Lagos, which we've mentioned a couple times today and earlier, was founded in many ways as a response to such institutions. Rather than reinforcing narratives of political conquest and economic domination through the displays of ownership of historical treasures, the CCA Lagos generated narratives grounded in the modes of the contemporary art world, but predicated on the dynamism of diverse Nigerian approaches. Each of these models provides particular insights into the moments and eras that shape the past, and each plays a role in generating the narratives that will become our history for the future. The Smithsonian National Museum of African Art is part of yet a different institutional model, but it is worth examining its history as it provides a lens through which to understand the times and some of the factors that influence who and what came to represent African art and artists over the past 50 plus years, particularly within an American context. And it's really interesting to sort of see this build upon, what Perrin presented earlier. So founded on August 10th, 1846, what would become the Smithsonian Institution began as a gift of money from an Englishman who actually had never stepped foot in North America. But he gave it as a gift to a new nation to create an institution for the generation and dissemination of knowledge. Early leaders of the Smithsonian had to debate what this even meant. I mean, was this building going to be a collection? Was it going to be more like a university model? How were they going to generate and disseminate knowledge? And so it took, over these past 18 decades, the Smithsonian has grown to include 19 museums, 9 research centers, and a zoo. And so the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art is not the natural history museum that Perrin discussed earlier. It's another one of these 19 museums within what is the largest complex of museums on Earth. As with all institutions with a history, the Smithsonian's past reflects traumas upon which our present is built. The land on which its original structures are located, along the iconic grassy strip between the US Capitol and the Washington Monument, so you see it all the time, that's sort of in front of the Capitol, that huge green, and it's lined on each side by museums. So it's known as the National Mall, and this was once the terrain of the Anacostan and Nacotchtank communities. The original Smithsonian structure itself, known as the castle, was constructed with stone, likely quarried by enslaved laborers, considered at the time to be owned by the great-grandson of the United States' first lady, so George Washington's wife, Martha Custis Washington. And it's really important that we say these names and recognize these histories, because this is literally the land on which we are built, and very much the human history that is under-recognized within the way that these narratives have been created. Okay, approximately 118 years after James Smithson made his gift to the US, Warren Robins, a retired Foreign Service officer, founded what would be called the Center for Cross-Cultural Communication. So 15 years after that, in 1979, its museum would become part of the Smithsonian as the National Museum of African Art. So Robins had fallen in love with the African art he encountered while posted in Germany. And he returned to the United States during the height of the American Civil Rights Movement. And despite the extraordinary efforts of historically Black institutions like Howard University, Fisk, Hampton, as well as the Harman Foundation that we heard about earlier today, there was he considered there to be insufficient recognition within the United States of the historic accomplishments of Africa and Africans. Thus, in 1964, he opened the Center for Cross-Cultural Communication with the Museum of African Art as a part of it, in the Capitol Hill row house that had once been a home to the legendary statesman, author, and abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Robins imagined and realized a museum that would promote awareness of the intellectual, technical, and artistic influence of Africans and individuals of African descent worldwide. He arranged the building so that there was one gallery dedicated actually to the life of Frederick Douglass, but then another was actually comprised of works of original African art, but it was combined with posters and reproductions, as well as some original works by artists who had been influenced by African art. So a fabulous painting by Wilfredo Lam, along with posters by Picasso and so forth. And then there was also space for changing exhibitions. Robbins was not, however, necessarily thinking about women or the rising feminism of the times. The vision under which the museum was built, both its collections and exhibitions program, was more closely attuned to the principles of Black pride. Its collection came in largely by way of gifts, with the first work of art being an Edo Ekikobo from Nigeria, an altar to a man's right hand. This tribute to a person's ability to accomplish seems fitting in terms of Warren Robbins's drive, but is also, in its genderedness, rather telling towards the gender naive approach that he brought to the museum. So from its earliest days, the museum collected and exhibited Africa's modern and contemporary arts. In 1966, it accessioned this untitled sketch by Sudanese legend Ibrahim El Salahi. It comes from El Salahi's first exhibition in the United States and is a study from his earliest efforts to create a new modernist vocabulary that's based on really the skeleton or bones of the Arabic script. And you can really see how he's sort of sorting this out in this wonderful study. But it would be actually 3 more years before the museum acquired a work of art by a female identifying artist. And the acquisition offers insight into really the under-recognized realities by which collections are built. People think that it's so purposeful, but often it really, really isn't. So in 1969, the Museum of African Art was an emerging institution trying to secure funds, collections, and recognition to establish itself for the future. The director wanted to build the numbers in the collection to appear successful both to the audiences he was trying to grow, but also to the donors he was trying to bring in to donate more works of art and to give the money that would keep the museum operational. And so he sought diversity in terms of what materials and media were represented in the collection and the geographic and temporal range of the objects, but the artworks really came in more by the chance of donations than by the strategy of purchases. So when a Mr. and Mrs. Alan Kulikow approached the museum with the offer of a painting by Pauline Ray Boswell, which you can see on the left, Robbins himself actually wrote the letter of recognition and acceptance. And in it, he said, quote, "I would like to thank you for the East African temper painting by Ray." So he gets her name wrong and he doesn't even attribute her nationality. "We appreciate your continued interest in the museum's programs and for helping our permanent collection of paintings grow," end quote. Robbins's emphasis appears to have been in growing the numbers of paintings in the collection, overthinking about the genre, technique, or exhibition record of the painter. And this is where it really does show this arbitrariness, because Pauline Ray Boswell was only 15 years old. And this actually came from a youth arts competition. She had actually no idea herself that her painting was even in a museum collection until 2018. And while she has never considered herself to be a professional artist, it was her love of art that inspired her niece, Phoebe Boswell, to become an artist. And many of us know Phoebe now. It would be 22 more years after the museum had relocated to its current premises before the Museum of African Art put money down and purchased its first work by a woman artist, the elegant, reduced angled spouted black piece by the internationally acclaimed Magdalene Odundo. In the early 1990s, Odundo was perhaps the contemporary artist most collected by museums in the US and Europe, for at least those museums with African collections. As scholar Marla Burns wrote later that decade, quote, "Odundo has found a place within mainstream institutional structures because her work retains a formal and technical alliance with what is considered to be authentically African. Fired clay containers. Odundo's African fit is also no doubt aided by her gender, since village-based pottery across the continent is most often made by women," end quote. And as with its collecting practices, early exhibitions at the Museum of African Art were both ahead of their times and reflective of the limited perspectives of the day. 1968 marked the opening of Ethiopian paintings at the museum. This was followed by the Nigerian sculptures of Lamidi Fakeye in 1973, an exhibition called Contemporary African Art in 1974, and Senegalese or contemporary Senegalese tapestries in 1978, the opening of which Leopold Senghor attended. So the museum really was actively trying to routinely put forward exhibitions that showed what was happening on the continent and how diverse and thriving it was. But this early recognition of contemporary expression on the continent was not matched by an equal attention to the individuality of the artists, nor to the gender dynamics that shape the visibility of some over others. So, as I just said, Lamidi Fakié was recognized by name in 1973, but a full year earlier, in 1972, the museum had hosted its first monographic show of the female artist, Ladi Kwali. And again, we heard about this earlier with Karen. Her exhibition, however, was entitled Contemporary Nigerian Pottery, without the inclusion of her name. And as we have seen over these past 4 days, such allusions were too frequent and have very, not even subtle, but I mean, certainly a very significant impact in how we know what we know. So when the Museum for African Art became part of the Smithsonian by an act of Congress in 1979, it moved alongside that castle, the original Smithsonian structure, and its leadership was soon taken over by the first of the museum's 4, and hopefully soon to be 5, female museum directors. In its space, the museum was designed to signal the Smithsonian as an international platform. The African Art Museum's architecture mirrors that of the Sackler Gallery of Asian Art next door. And it's actually connected underground by multiple galleries that have doors that enter one another, and one even shared gallery space. So its new director, Sylvia Williams, became an important advocate for Africa's contemporary arts. She corresponded directly with artists, personally brought in key acquisitions by Muhammad Omar Khalil, among others, and hired the museum's first dedicated curator of contemporary art. Even with this attention to contemporary arts being produced on the continent and by African artists internationally, the museum was only able to acquire what was available on the market. And this is something that you really see. So, what came in reflects the limits of the very limited gallery structures, what collectors were bringing back, ambassadors and so forth on their travels, so who they were seeing, where the curators themselves were able to get, and really the attitudes of the time, most especially. And again, we've been talking about this over these past few days. So the museum opened in its new space with a special exhibition of sculptures by Sokari Douglas Camp. Like Adundo, her work was seen as both contemporary and identifiably African. 13 years later, the museum would acquire some of the key works from that exhibition, including Church Ede, which you can see here. In the acquisition documents written by curator Rosalind Walker at the time, she states that, quote, trained in Western art institutions, Camp has absorbed the Western modern aesthetic and mastered modern techniques of painting and sculpture. She is an international artist. However, Sokari has never severed her ties to the Kalabari Ija, end quote, which of course she shouldn't. Walker's reference to Douglas Camp's Kalabari Ija heritage reflects an unnuanced trend in the West to frame the artist's practice as somehow more authentically African than that of many of her peers. In the 1990s, the marriage of skill, identifiably African markers like Kalabari Ija funerary practices, and a practice based in the West, for both Adundo and Douglas Camp were living in England at the time, gained, and still are, gained the artists access to global markets at a time when many other women and many other artists had none. So through the launch of journals like Revue Noire and Inca and so forth, which Revue Noire had been actually 5 years earlier than this point, and Inca 3 years earlier, artists really started to gain traction. And then there's a whole host of curators and so forth, and just the artists themselves who really changed this. But this is that moment when it's happening. So it's interesting to note that the museum also acquired 6 of William Kentridge's 9 drawings for projection in 1996, the same year that Church Ede was acquired. As an artist working outside the art world centers of New York, London, and Paris, Kentridge was relatively unknown at that time, and his work did not match characteristics considered to be discernibly African. The museum paid 1/10 the price for its drawings for projection than it did for Church Ede, a disparity that is hard to imagine today. In subsequent years, Kentridge's prices have skyrocketed, while Douglas Camp's have not, again reflecting the more dominant trends of gender inequity when it comes to artists' earnings from the sales of their work. So work by women artists continued to enter the museum's collection over the next 2 decades. But again, these acquisitions often came about as a consequence of attendant issues, like the desire to represent South Africa after the fall of apartheid, rather than an attention to gender equity. So important works by Bernie Searle, Kim Berman, and Sue Williamson all came into the collection as a part of the museum's efforts to attend to the issues of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and to showcase the powerful arts being created in an aspiringly democratic South Africa. It was not until 2012, nearly 40 years after first opening its doors, that the museum undertook a collections assessment, focused not on the distribution of its collections based on media, like growing the number of its paintings, or the representations of important schools or well-recognized names, but on concerns of gender representation and inclusion. This reveals how essential it is that we, the men, women, non-binary individuals, and communities of the 21st century, ask new questions and develop actionable tactics to make for new futures and shape new narratives. Once the National Museum of African Art approached our collection through this lens, we ascertained that only 11% of the named artists in our collection self-identified as women. And I know, I mean, it is terrible. It's not good enough. And that's what we recognize, but it's also better than a lot of other museums. And I say that because we have to recognize how bad the situation is. And so as a result, we have now raised our percentage to 22% of the named artists in our collection today are women, or identified as women. So accomplishing this takes effort. It requires looking through limited records to identify formative artists like Bertina Lopes of Mozambique, and Nancy Dantas gave a great paper about her on Tuesday. So these women whose stories might otherwise go under-recognized. It also means sometimes not acquiring work by an important male artist. Building collections alone is not enough, however. The Smithsonian National Museum of African Art has launched a women's initiative that, in addition to improving the gender balance within its collections, seeks to increase the visibility of women artists and professionals in African art through generating exhibitions, public programs, and publications routinely, but not as single projects and not just for a year, but ongoing. And I think there's been a lot of press lately around the idea of, the Year of Women or something like that. And we have to make it entrenched, and we have to make it daily. We can't make it an exemption that you then get a pass and move on, one and done. The exhibition and book, I Am Contemporary Women Artists of Africa, is part of this ongoing initiative. It finds its logic in second wave feminist scholars like Marcia Meskiman by avoiding, quote, a category of objects defined as women arts, and instead exploring the contingency of women and art coming together to make and remake meaning, end quote. And in this case, in the particular social situations and aesthetic encounters of the nebulous context of Africa's modern and contemporary arts, and in the context of the history of this museum. So it tries to model a more dynamic approach to gender as an organizational principle beyond well-known tropes like women in craft or women in the body. The title refers to a 1970s feminist anthem, I Am Woman, in part to raise the question of why it is that 50 years later, we still need to be having this conversation and exhibitions like this. And why is it that women still find their numbers underrepresented in politics, business, and museum collections? And therefore, such museum exhibitions remain necessary. And Martha gave a great paper too, where she was talking about you can just have exhibitions where women are in it or women are the focus without giving the title of that. But I think we need to have both, because you need to actually make the point as well that we're not finished yet, and then continually generate exhibitions that just have women artists, because of course that's where they should be. So it also signals an approach that is based on individual perspective and not any single narrative of womanhood. The exhibition explores the vital contributions of women to the full spectrum of the human experience, including to issues of the environment, identity, politics, race, sexuality, social activism, and more. Crossing generational, linguistic, and media divides, the 30 artworks by 28 artists included came from the museum's permanent collection, many brought in as a result of the Women's Initiative. And so what you're seeing here is actually inside, that was inside the gallery. And so these are sort of the peripherals. And so this focus on individuality was reinforced by the inclusion of the artists' voices as much as possible. So as you actually enter the museum and walk down to the gallery, quotes by the women artists appear on the wall as you walk down. And then this is continued by the projection of quotes on the floor of the gallery inside. And we did it on the floor instead of on the walls because we didn't want anything to actually take away from the art, but we wanted to emphasize their voices. And at the same time, quotes by as many of the artists as possible were included in the labels. So for anyone that I wasn't able to interview, many of the artists were actually kind enough to send me, just using their phone or something, a video of themselves speaking about their artworks. Or for artists who had passed on, I just dug through whatever I could find to find their voices. And sometimes, you'd be surprised how hard it is to find their voice instead of somebody speaking for them. So, and I just also wanted to note that the photograph that you see on the top left of the quotes is before. There's a sculpture by the artist Radamère that is actually now installed beneath that, where you can see a person standing there. So, and in addition, it's always important to try and make these experiences engaged so that the audience has something that they participate in as well. So we did try to create selfie stations, and sort of a low-tech way as well was offering stickers that people could use to, again, go out on social media, but just take the exhibition outside or their experience outside the museum walls. And so the sticker said things like, I am woman, I am artist, I am activist, I am original. And so the first works of art encountered included this stunning portrait or self-portrait by Nigeria's Njideka Akinyuli Crosby, and her composure really just seems such a powerful way to draw audiences in. And just next to it, which you can't see, but around the wall to the right, is a sculpture by Morocco's Batul Shimi. And I really just loved her cutting use of the pressure cooker to speak to the rising pressure to address women's issues worldwide. And so she just brings this cheeky precision by sending, this most domestic of objects, a cooking pot, as an ambassador out into the world. And so although the galleries were not arranged according to sections, they did follow the same logic as was outlined in the book. And so in it, the artworks flowed between three topics derived from a quote by New York Times art critic Roberta Smith. And so Roberta Smith was actually writing in response to, the important global feminisms exhibition, to which Ngone Fall actually contributed a really important essay to those of you who haven't read it. But in response to the exhibition, Roberta Smith had written that feminism is not a style nor a formal approach. It is a philosophy, an attitude, and a political instrument. And so working with that, the exhibition and the book were sort of organized along the lines of living the philosophy, working with attitude, and instruments of politics and faith, because I thought it was really important that we recognize faith as well as the secular topic of politics. And so in terms of how this looked, the artworks were arranged in conversation with one another in ways that allowed for opportunities to see how the artist might approach related themes or share related techniques, but to express diverse ends. So stitch works by Billy Zangewa were alongside Sindeni Marasala and appeared in proximity to the print of a wedding dress by Nampumulela Goma. Two paintings based on Adare textiles by Chief Nike Davies Okundai, and also the painting you see at the center, the gown that has been painted by the Nigerian designer Patience Torlowe. And so Patience actually named that dress Esther in tribute to her mother. And as she says, Esther is not a dress, Esther is a force. And so pioneering artists appear alongside emerging artists and leaders in the contemporary art world to reveal how women might engage with such feminized media as thread and fashion, but to address such differing issues as parental anxiety and access to healthy foods, redressing historical wrongs, resource extraction, and political agency. So as you move throughout the exhibition, issues like the environment, identity, sexuality, and self-representation were concerns for multiple of the artists. From Wangechi Mutu's Afrofuturist superpower of a female figure that, as she says, reveals the quote, that art is a means to reflect and question our coexistence with the unfathomable magnificence of nature, end quote. to Mwangi Hutter's poetic exploration of the traces we leave on the Earth's surfaces, and to Francis Goodman's unsettling juxtaposition of a deflated car seat with pearls. And so you see that on the left. And as she says, you know, a single pearl in a car seat speaks to that first kiss or the innocence of a romantic encounter when you're first falling in love. But when you see a cascade of pearls, it really takes on a sinister and unsettling edge and speaks to the violence of sex for sale. And as she said, she also just loved deflating this masculine icon of the car seat and just having it hang limp on the wall. So, you know, this sort of activism is a recurring basis to much of the artwork in the exhibition. And in relation to their powerful series, Faces and Phases, of which the portrait of Pamdungwane is a part, and I shared that earlier, visual activist, but you can sort of see it on the right there. Visual activist Zanele Maholi has said that they are, quote, talking about what you see, a right to see. Visuals are important because you see. End quote. So in the case of their work, this essential right and need to make visible focuses on advocacy for Africa's lesbians and LGBTQ+ community, but also, as they say, quote, we are speaking about the emotional pain of not seeing people like you and thinking you are alone, end quote. The significance and politics of visibility also applies to how we review and understand the narratives of art history. Artworks along one wall dealt specifically with narratives of modernity and contemporaneity. The aforementioned painting by Bertina Lopes, a print by Suzanne Wenger, a ceramic vessel by Ladi Kwali, all speak to the complicated web of historical visibility and obfuscation. Both Ladi Kwali and Suzanne Wenger have been held up as models of African modernity, and this was accomplished in part through the writings of Wenger's first husband, Uli Bayer, who published the influential journal Black Orpheus. Wenger was born in Austria and disillusioned by the social corruption she experienced during the Second World War. She sought a community where creative expression and artists mattered. In the years following her arrival in Nigeria, she would divorce Bayer, actually marry a Yoruba man, become fluent in Yoruba language, and become an Olorisha, or priestess. She remained in Nigeria until her death nearly 60 years later. As part of her efforts to raise funds to help support the sacred groves of Oshogbo, she produced and sold prints such as the one on view here. And you see it sort of in the top right. For Bayer, Wenger's work offered a visual negritude in its synthesis of African and European cultural experiences and artistic traditions. So Ladi Kwali was a contemporary of Suzanne Wenger's and also a subject of Uli Bayer's 1968 book, Contemporary Art in Africa. And these are really some of the formative texts that a lot of people go back to when they're trying to reconstruct the archives and identify these important artists. And so whereas Wenger, the recurrent narrative goes, had developed Nigerian modernity when she brought European training to Yoruba epistemology, Nigerian-born Kwali moved from tradition to modernity by fusing the knowledge of Wari pottery she had acquired from her family with the globally oriented techniques of glazing and kiln firing she learned from the Abuja Pottery Training Center, an organization established by the British studio potter Michael Cardew in 1951. And so unlike Wenger, Kwali did not relocate, change nationality or faith, or even adopt a new medium. It was through her willingness to integrate techniques introduced by a European into her already established practice that she became part of a critically modern discourse. The predominant change was external, not internal. It was her audience that was altered. So the complexities of who is accepted within a discursive space, like modernity, and how they intersect with issues like gender, language, and simple chance are further borne out by an analysis of careers of artists like Lopes. So Bertina Lopes came from Mozambique, where she was an influential teacher and artist participating in salons alongside artists like Malangatana, who has often been positioned as the father of modernity in Mozambique. Lopes was out of town when Uli Bayer happened to visit Mozambique, however. It was Malangatana he met, and Malangatana he invited back to Nigeria and published in Black Orpheus. Malangatana has been featured in Anglophone literature ever since. whereas there is precious little information on Lopes in English or in French. As she later moved to Italy, most of the literature on her is in Portuguese or in Italian. To my knowledge, the National Museum of African Art is the first North American institution to acquire her work. Despite her significance, she's only just starting to gain recognition for her role in creating a modernist art movement in Mozambique and for her oeuvre overall. So A Vessel by Magdalena Dundo also appeared in this area, and it's to address really her role in the discourse around the contemporary relationship to Africa's arts. An extraordinary drawing of the Good Shepherd by South Africa's Diane Victor and a photographic triptych by Maimouna Gressi face Suzanne Wenger's print, in part to create the opportunity to explore the print in relation to the motivations that led to its creation. So it wasn't just there to speak to modernity, but also to speak on its own grounds of representing Wenger's interpretation of Yoruba faith. So what you had is that was here, and then on the opposite side are the Gressi and the Diane Victor. And so like Wenger, Gressi is an artist born in Europe who moved to an African country and embraced a new faith. Now based in Senegal, all Gressi's crisp and vibrant works speak to her Sufi faith. And so right next to that is Diane Wenger, who also draws upon religious iconography, but in her case, it's really to speak to secular ends. And her medium of drawing with fire speaks specifically to the topic at hand. So she uses the Good Shepherd, but I mean, it's also, you have to imagine what she's doing. She actually held a piece of paper over her head and then has a candle underneath, and she's able to control the brand of candle, the length of the wick, all of these given different tonalities to the carbon that's released from the candle. And then using just sheer muscle memory, she drew the Good Shepherd, and then at his feet is a fire with a house emerging from the flames. And so for her, this medium was the perfect metaphor to speak to the fragility of our housing market and housing in general, but particularly in relationship to the recent financial crisis, and looking to the Good Shepherd as a metaphor for the bankers and politicians who are supposed to be protecting us, because it's not really clear from the drawing whether they are protecting their flock or about to throw it in the fire. So the IM exhibition includes painting, fashion, sculpture, ceramics, drawing, time-based projection, and installation. So like Zanelli Maholi and others included in the project, Sue Williamson considers herself to be an activist, and in particular, a witness. 10 years after the last houses of the multiracial District 6 in Cape Town were demolished by South Africa's apartheid government, Williamson returned to the site to gather debris. And as she says, she went looking for the traces of the old community. She encased the building materials, toys, and so you'll see like hair barrettes and dolly shoes and bits of shower curtains encased in blocks of resin. And these are then installed as if they were settings and a glowing dinner table. And it's surrounded by photographs that came from the Last Supper in the home of her friend Nazgul Ibrahim. And you also hear the soundtrack of bulldozers and the conversation for dinner that night, as well as the smell of incense. So IM is but one part of a larger initiative, and it reveals how an institution can examine its own history in an exhibition as well as in a book format, the jacket of which can be seen here, but it's not an endpoint. So as I mentioned during the comments earlier, this past January, a special issue of the journal African Arts was released with a focus on the contemporary art world and the women who have not just changed the ways in which Africa and Africa's artists are positioned in the art world, but have changed the structures of the art world itself. And so AWARE is another organization that's doing this. This time, the focus was not on the artists, but the curators, gallery owners, nonprofit leaders, and entrepreneurs who have changed institutional approaches that have been taken for granted. So in addition to Ntobeko Ntombele, who I apologize to most sincerely for getting tongue-tied earlier, and Ngone Fall and BC Silva, there's also Toria El Glaoui and others like Els Vanderplas speaking about the Gates Foundation and the Prince Claus Fund and the role of such organizations really into transforming art world structures. So it's a provocation that begins in New York and includes voices from Newark, London, Paris, and Lagos, and the individuals whose home base shifts, holding a mirror up to the peripatetic nature of our globalizing times. It looks to where centers were and how they have moved, and it invites each of us to consider where they might go. As much as possible, the accounts were told by the women themselves. Each was asked to take on the uncomfortable task of writing about herself, or she was interviewed by another influential woman. And I point this out because too often women are not comfortable sharing their own stories, or they don't get asked. So assembled together, this journal offers a picture of the changing cultural shifts that took root over the past 40 years, and some of the under-recognized connections between these individuals and organizations, and the extraordinarily courageous and daring initiatives taken by so many of these women. And as Aneli Moholi has shown us, visibility matters, and we must be visible in as many spaces as possible. One person, one approach, one organization cannot affect all the change that needs to take place. And within organizations, attention must be brought to all departments and all systems. As the National Museum of African Art moves forward, we are building an online archive, drawing attention to trailblazing women who used photography as a tool to transform the disciplines of anthropology, architecture, art history, geography, and photojournalism. We have also partnered with external organizations. So, certainly we'd like to with AWARE, but also a Smithsonian-wide initiative that's called Because of Her Story, which amplifies the role of women in American history. Another program of which I am particularly attached is the Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship, a globally competitive residency that offers artists across museum access to museums, archives, and scholars across the Smithsonian. And it really provides the space for artists to have the time to think, to create the best and new work. And so over the past 12 years, some of these fellows include Peju Alatise, Karamer, Zarina Bimji, Christine Dixie, Mary Evans, Modupiola Fadugba, Milumbe Hayembe, Anawana Haloba, Ayana V. Jackson, Marcia Correa, Shoya Kyambi, Sade McConan, Ato Melinda, Nansikilelo Mutiti, Temitayo Ogunbi, Mary Sabande, and Sue Williamson. We also hope to organize a publication series of monographs of women artists to make sure that no museum moving forward can say that I've never heard of this artist, but there's nothing written on this woman. And AWARE is definitely doing extraordinary work on that front. In addition, we are continuing momentum started with IM with a series of monographic exhibitions. The next of these will be the first solo museum show by Ayana V. Jackson, and illustrates a commitment to not just showing the work of women artists, but also helping them propel their work in new directions. So From the Deep in the Wake of Drexcia with Ayana V. Jackson consists of all new work, including a suite of photographs, costume, video, and sound, and some of which are new arenas for the artists. So for this immersive multimedia project, Jackson has been inspired by the Detroit-based 1990s techno band Drexcia, a duo made of the musicians James Stinson and Gerald Donald, whose albums imagined a mythical aquatopia in the Atlantic Ocean, populated by women and their unborn children who were thrown or jumped or able to jump overboard during the Middle Passage. So Stinson and Donald envisioned a world of empowered and sometimes vengeful Africans living beneath the sea. In Drexcia, drawing upon the imagery of goddesses, however, from Trinidad to Senegal, Jackson will cast a feminist spin on Drexcia, and the work is really quite stunning. Our actions are not just limited to changing exhibitions, but are also being hardwired into the ways in which art is being placed on view in the long-term or permanent collection galleries. And so here you can actually see Sudanese legend Kamala Ishak standing in front of a wall we have been reserving for a painting by her as part of a display dedicated to the Khartoum School and Sudanese modern art. After 3 years of working with the artist to identify the right work, we acquired a part of a film from the period in which the artist was developing her crystallist vision. And it can take money to bring about change, but it's important to realize that organizations can look for new kinds of support. So the National Museum of African Art recently received an American History grant, and grants are not always available, and I don't want to pretend that they are, but I do want to point out that we can think about ways of telling the stories or asking the questions in ways that actually can allow us to tap into new kinds of sources or to think creatively about how to work with what we have. And so we asked for support to deepen our collection of works of art by women who move between Africa and America to challenge and diversify presumptions of who Americans are, and to provide essential connections for the communities of African descent living throughout the local region and across the United States. So among these artists were Ruby Onyenyechi-Amanze, Adebunmi Badabo, Tade Makonnen, Wura Natasha Ogunji, and Zina Sarawiwa. The youngest, Adebunmi Badabo, created the multi-part True Blue after ascertaining that her Nigerian-born family had been enslaved on a plantation in South Carolina called True Blue. The artist innovated a technique to move beyond the canvas-based practices she associates with whiteness, and in particular, white men's domination over what gets represented from history. Combining documents related to the plantation, such as lists of enslaved workers and plantation owners' wills, and the plantation's owner's will, with resources that would have grown there like cotton, rice, and indigo, and hair clippings that retain human DNA. The artist creates handmade paper portraits. Each is named for an individual enslaved at True Blue, like Hannah, a piece that includes an architect's romanticized blueprints of the plantation, and Little Anthony, a tribute to one of the 3 named infants who died there. In contrast to Badabo's cutting examination of her family's American past, Ruby Onyenyechi-Amanze imagines futuristic dreamscapes in a quest to materialize her experience of displacement and dislocation. Raised on 3 continents, Amanze considers Lagos, London, Brooklyn, and now Philadelphia all to be home. Working with architectural lines to disorient viewers' experience of space, and then populating her drawings with avatars, leopard-headed men, birds, and other recurring characters, she creates non-narrative, free-floating compositions as an act of revolution, what she refers to as a post-colonial non-nationalism. Work such as Audrey and I, Ghanaian Beaches, speaks to America as a, quote, context zone, a space where cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, to return to the words of Marie-Louise Pratt. Ruby Onyenyechi-Amanze also appears in Wura Natasha Ogunji's video, based on a 2013 performance, Will I Still Carry Water When I Am a Dead Woman, from Lagos. That is, and the video follows the artists as they explore gendered labor and the politics of change. Unlike Amanze, however, who was born in Nigeria and settled in the US, Ogunji was born in the US and chose to move to Lagos. For her, this allows her to understand the Nigerian and specifically Yoruba roots of her Americanness. She explores these tensions between geography, memory, and the body across media. Born and raised in Washington, D.C., Tade Makonnen critiques forced migration and violence against citizens of color in U.S. history. She weaves together her identity as the daughter of Ethiopian immigrants and experience as Black woman in America to create works like Senite and the Home, The Peacemaker, and The Comforter. Named for a mother and her 6-month-old son who died in a German asylum center, it is part of a body of works in which the artist calls out the names of Black men and women who died as a result of state violence or neglect. For her, it is a vital part of the Black Lives Matter movement. To realize her vision, Makonnen created mirrored light towers so that we might see ourselves in this history. She cut into them silhouettes of Ethiopian crosses that honor both the numbers of Ethiopians in the US, the largest population after Ethiopia, and the peace and hope offered through faith. Like Makonnen and Jackson, mourning an individual lost to state violence shaped the work of Zina Sarawiwa. The daughter of Nigerian activist Ken Sarawiwa, the artist now lives in Los Angeles. In Sarawiwa Mourning, we see her cry for the first time since her father's murder. While the institutional history I have discussed is specific, the issues it reveals impact us all. So to conclude, I would like to draw on the words of South African-born cultural historian and theorist Griselda Pollock. She writes, quote, "In the end, all our histories will be just that, stories we tell ourselves. Thus, to enter critically into the problematic of narrative, representation, history, and the politics of meaning, We shall need self-awareness of who we are when we tell a story, what its effects will be, what is excluded, and how contingent it will be, however diligent we are in our scholarship and research. We need to know where our institutions come from. We need to ask new questions to change the stories we institutionalize for histories in the future. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Karen. Merci infiniment. C'est absolument voilà, passionnant et inspirant aussi. Donc, j'invite les participants à laisser leurs questions, encore une fois, dans l'espace donc dédié en bas de leur écran, et je me ferai un plaisir de les partager. Donc, je peux aussi demander d'ailleurs à nos panélistes d'aujourd'hui, s'ils ont aussi des questions, de ne pas hésiter à le faire savoir. C'est très intéressant et j'espère que, voilà, que beaucoup d'institutions prendront conscience de cette nécessité de faire l'examen de leur collection, de leur politique d'acquisition et d'exposition et d'accrochage des œuvres. Moi, j'avais une question sur ce que vous abordez dans les années 80, en fait, l'influence du marché de l'art et de l'influence de ce qui était visible dans les galeries, et que finalement on achetait, l'institution achetait ce qui était visible par les galeries. Cette influence n'est-elle pas finalement toujours le cas? On voit par exemple aujourd'hui la présence massive d'artistes sud-africains, par exemple, parce que le marché de l'art en Afrique du Sud est particulièrement structuré, est particulièrement fort, contrairement à d'autres pays du continent. Donc, est-ce que ce n'est pas finalement aussi un signe que les institutions devraient arrêter de se reposer, on va dire, sur le marché de l'art et prospecter beaucoup plus, finalement, indépendamment du marché, bien sûr.
Absolutely. And actually, I'd kind of like to take a detour for a second to say that, my talk was really speaking about institutional knowledge and institutional history, which is not, as I said, what we need ultimately. I mean, it is important. Museums are the place in which we collect the objects that will become the objects that we use to tell our history moving forward. But we need to have other kinds of organizations and movements and artist collectives and so forth that provide counters to this always. And one of the reasons for this is because of what you're saying. I mean, what is able to be collected, what goes into these kinds of repositories is quite loaded and quite biased according to whatever's happening at that moment. Today, the market is definitely, if anything, more powerful than it was then. But there's other forms that by which we can approach bringing artworks into collections. And collecting is also not the only way that knowledge is going to be perpetuated. So, when I travel, I don't necessarily just buy what's in a gallery. And the most important thing to do, really, from a curatorial perspective, is to look beyond the galleries. I mean, they are important, but what is a current taste is not necessarily the most significant message moving forward. And when I travel anywhere, it's the artists I reach out to, and the artists are going to know who's making something that's exciting. And so it's, none of us knows enough. And so I have to rely on the knowledge of people who are in other parts of the world and talk to them and establish the friendships and relationships like Sanam was speaking about yesterday, or tap into them so that, we can do better. And really, that's all I'm trying to talk about. Not that the Smithsonian has it right, because clearly we don't. It's that as we all strive to do better, how do we do that? And so it is, one, recognizing that the market is not the end all and be all. And then also, in addition to that, figuring out other ways to establish these kinds of relationships. And I'd like to actually give a shout out on that note to KNUST, because I think that what's happening there and with Black Star Lines is some of the most interesting, actionable tactics being, occurring anywhere.
Thank you, Karen, for that. Thank you very much for appreciating us.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, also the point is that when you do not have institutions, you need to create your own institutions. You need to create your own networks and your working friendships and relations that then bring attention to the little efforts that you are trying to put forth. So thanks for the recognition.
And I have to say that, you know, if it weren't for COVID, I would have been in Kumasi. So travel has been a challenge. But, you know, on that note, one of the interesting things that's happening, I think, because of the restrictions of COVID is people are getting less dependent on, I can't get there, you know, I can't afford to get on a plane and get there. It's still, as we've been experiencing and talking about over this past week, you know, access to computers and internet and so forth are hugely challenging. But I think the whole way that we carry out research or carry out, I don't like the word research necessarily, but carry out our you know, our networking is changing. And, you know, for instance, I'm working on a documentary in Zambia right now, and rather than me being in Zambia, I figured out a way to pay a videographer in Zambia. And so he's now shooting the footage, and he's got the phone and he's holding me on WhatsApp so that I can ask questions, but he's filming it. And I really kind of like it, because now the money that would have gone to my plane ticket is going directly into the local community, and the vision that's emerging is coming more out from, you know, locally.
Mais nous devons tous et toutes s'adapter et trouver des nouvelles stratégies, de nouvelles façons de travailler dans ce contexte voilà, inédit. Il y a une question de Ngone. I am exhibition. Are all the works for the museum's collection? And did you purchase new works specifically for this project?
So first of all, the Women's Initiative has included a one-year consultancy with Ngone Fall, so she should get credit for that. And it was part of a broader initiative that was funded by the Ford Foundation and allowed for artists and scholars from around the world to come together to also talk about these issues, much like Aware has also been doing. So, you know, as Ngone knows, when she came to the museum, we did have women artists in our collection, but we had only just started to really become conscientious about a demographic breakdown. And I have to say that, you know, it's not necessarily a pretty or exciting thing. You know, it was literally me sitting at my computer with making cross hatches as I tried to figure out, you know, who were the artists we had from every country, what media did we have represented from every country, how many, you know, were female artists, how many were male identifying artists, and so forth, moving through it. So what you saw in the exhibition and is covered in the book included works that were specifically acquired as part of the Women's Initiative, but not exclusively. So many of those artworks had come in ahead of the Women's Initiative. So it's like among some of the ones that I spoke about in a little bit more detail, the Sue Williamson came in around 2000. And I tried to include actually the accession information on all of the artworks so that people could see the dates that they had been acquired. But the Bertina Lopes was actually acquired years before, a year or two before we even started thinking about the Women's Initiative, and was one of the instigators, because I started to realize in bringing that work in how woefully underrepresented women modernists were in the collection. I mean, modern art in general in our collection is a gap that we're trying to address, but particularly women like Amy Nimmer, Athia Kong, Bertina Lopes, you know, there's a number of really important artists who are starting to enter the collection that hadn't necessarily been.
Alors, un commentaire de Monica. I'd like to comment the panelists for their recuperation of the works and lives of 20th century artists who are no longer with us. This type of artistic practice is not easy. What have you found to be most difficult about researching and presenting overlooked women?
Well, I'll say, first of all, a shout out to Monica, because she organized a panel for the upcoming ACASA, African Art Triennial in June, a panel that's focused on African women modernists. So, you know, she's also part of trying to help this scholarship come forward. And no, it's not easy. And again, sort of to this theme of networks, you know, it really requires people talking to one another. So, you know, Felicia, you know, one of the, you know, I mentioned wanting to have the a monographic series, and one of the artists I really wanted to open the series with, as a, you know, a publication series, is Felicia Ban. But finding somebody to write that history can sometimes be a challenge. And then secondly, you know, or a second incentive in having something like the publication series in and of itself is so that young scholars coming up know that they can get paid and have an incentive to set aside the time to record this history, because that, of course, is one of the biggest challenges. Not everybody has the luxury of going unpaid to write this and to find this information. And so, you know, that's really a hugely significant issue. And all of this is, you know, putting money towards internships so that, again, people can afford to do the digging, so that, you know, people know that they're going to get paid to have this information come out. But in terms of how you do it, I mean, it's just vigilance, you know, to quote Harry Potter, constant vigilance. You know, look, you know, you have to think about, is there a woman in the gallery? Is, you know, if we're talking about Egyptian surrealism, you know, don't leave in Giafluatan out. You know, you have to think about how we tell the stories, and then doggedly look for the information. And for myself, I do not speak Portuguese or Italian, so Bertina Lopes was a challenge for me. And I, you know, relied on the assistance of colleagues who could help me overcome my own inadequacies.
Merci. Oui, c'est vrai que c'est finalement compliqué et difficile d'avoir à combler en fait les blancs. Et plutôt dans le colloque, on parlait justement aussi de cet équilibre entre raconter des histoires, et puis des fois il faut voilà, il y a la part de justement de ces du récit de ces projections en fait que l'on doit faire sur ce manque, en fait, sur ce manque que l'on essaye de combler, mais qui est le fruit du coup de notre imaginaire, de nos inspirations. Et donc il faut être aussi honnête et transparent, je pense, aussi dans nos façons de travailler parfois sur voilà, qu'il y a des manques qui ne peuvent pas être totalement comblés, en tout cas de manière scientifique et véridique. Et des fois, du coup, l'invitation que Perrine, par exemple, a fait à Ndidi Dike est intéressante, parce que c'est une autre façon aussi de raconter des histoires et de combler les manques en créant d'autres relations, justement. Moi, j'avais du coup une question justement sur l'enjeu que représentent les monographies, puisque je pense que depuis une trentaine d'années, il y a eu beaucoup d'expositions d'artistes femmes africaines de la diaspora, mais beaucoup moins de monographies, d'expositions monographiques et de publications monographiques, comme si finalement les femmes africaines existaient en tant que collectif, en tant que communauté, et qu'il était plus difficile en fait de les faire exister de manière individuelle. Et en effet, du coup, encore une fois, sur cette question dont parle Linda Nochlin, la question des opportunités, offrir les mêmes opportunités et les mêmes moyens, et donc les monographies, forcément, voilà, représentent un enjeu d'opportunités et de moyens en termes de visibilité des artistes.
Well, I think, you know, Camille and the work of everybody at AWARE, first of all, has been in recognition of the need to have monographic knowledge out there. And although it's a different kind of enterprise, I also commend Wikipedia for having wikiathons to, again, try and get information on individual women artists, more information than 500 words. And people need to have reliable information. And so it's essential that we have the monographs that actually delve into these broader contexts for each of the artists' work and become available for teaching in the future, for exhibitions in the future. I mean, we can't know what we haven't got access to. And you know, all of us know who've Chini was speaking about, you know, it's extraordinarily difficult. Sometimes you go to the archives and there's simply nothing there. And so, you know, one of the reasons I wanted to start a monographic series is to make sure that we have really meaningful publications out there on Felicia Ban, Esther Malongu, Kamala Ishak. I was actually trying to focus really on the women who are alive now, like Esther and Kamala, because they're 80. And if their monographs aren't written now, that archive's going down with them, and it's going to become reconstructive where it doesn't have to be. And so it's really essential. I mean, anyone who's a professor and has graduate students, I mean, really encourage them to work with that older generation. That's what's at stake, is our ability to hold on to, you know, this talent for future generations to learn from. Bernard wants to speak.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, whilst, so for Monica's question about the 20th century artists, it's difficult researching on them, looking for material on them, but we also stand the chance of losing what is happening right under our noses, because my interest is also in how we are documenting current practices that also stand a chance of being lost if we sort of lose focus of what is happening now and then only speak to the past. And so this is my need to complicate the space. How do we go back and dig up all that we've left behind, and also make sure that we are digging up what we are doing now, so that we do not have to come back and dig into the past, which is now our present. Yeah, this once again is what I said earlier about the space for women art administrators or curators as before. It's really for the institutions to be interested in the work of individual artists. And this is a case for research, this is a case for travel, and also to contact the networks that exist within the countries. As Karen was saying, sometimes it's good to go off the gallery trench and follow the studios of artists. In this way, I don't want to use the word discover, but you'll meet artists who are actually working, whose practices would invite a certain conversation with an institutional showing. And so, yeah, these are important things. Even as like Exit Frame, we are showing it's a group exhibition. And yeah, I've been discussing with certain colleagues that the group exhibition, which has usually been the way through which African artists appear to the world, has to be challenged now. I think it is time to start doing away with the group exhibition and to concentrate on practices of individual artists, yeah, as a way forward.
I just want to add a word of support for that idea. I think that we could benefit so much from finding more of a balance in publications, but also in exhibitions between group shows, but also monographic exhibitions. And really, from my perspective, it's a problem of time. It takes such time to really delve into the practice of a single artist, and worthy time for sure. But yeah, it's something that I would really like to see, because I often think that it can be useful to provide a frame, you know, of an individual artist's career. That built-in frame, you know, then lends itself to so many possibilities beyond it, the context that individual is interacting with, the different people that come into their particular life. And so I would love to see more of that personally. And it's, I mean, the exhibition I'm working on is a group exhibition, but my own personal PhD research has been a monographic study. And I pursued that research for these reasons, because I really wanted to go deep and see what I could really find. So yes, that's just my input. Thank you.
Okay, so I think basically a lot has been said already, but well, to add to that, I am thinking that aside looking at individual arts practices, we should, and I've said this before, we should allow for growth, and then we should not consider the artist as a part of a group. We should not consider the artist as someone who we know, whose practice that we know, but we should look at the extension of how far the artist can go. And then there was one other point, but it's gone now, but I hope I can remember, and then I would add up.
Personnellement, je rajouterais que néanmoins, je trouve que l'exposition collective n'est pas totalement à mettre de côté également, mais elle peut être repensée. On pense souvent à des expositions de 20 artistes, alors que ou de 10 artistes, alors qu'on peut penser aussi des expositions de 2 artistes. Si je pense là à ma contribution à ce colloque avec ce récit-là à partir de 2 artistes, Miranda Byrne et Nicole, et Clara et Boudouaga, qui ne s'étaient jamais croisés de leur vie, même à partir d'artistes qui ne se sont jamais croisés de leur vie et qui ont pourtant appartenu à la même génération. Il y a des manières de construire l'exposition collective qui peut être totalement renouvelée. Et voilà, je pense que c'est aussi une forme à investir, mais avec une autre manière, des manières peut-être plus spéculatives et moins thématiques.
C'est ce que disait Karen en parlant notamment d'exposition IAM, avec cette idée de créer une conversation, de créer du dialogue en fait entre les œuvres et entre les artistes. Et du coup, je pense que c'est aussi, en effet, ce que vous avez fait, Amandine, à travers votre recherche, ce que fait Perrine également à travers son projet. C'est ce qu'on essaye tous de faire, en fait, créer du dialogue et engager une conversation, des conversations collectives, multiples et diversifiées.
Amandine, I'm also with you on that point. It's not to totally throw away the group show, because it is also through the group show that people get a launching pad, isn't it? But as you said, also to be able to, like in our presentation, to bring people of various generations to come into conversation. Even in our presentation, we showed Esther Matangu and Felicia Aban, who are actually of the same age, but their practices are quite diverse. And so, yeah, thank you for this jolt.
So, yes, it came. On Tuesday, there were some presentations on the lost narratives, and they looked at artists from some countries that we actually hardly look at. So I think aside the group presentations, the group exhibition, that we are still going to focus on, not thrashing it entirely, looking at the individual art practices from these countries that are underrepresented. So you realize that there's a dominance with Nigerian and South African artists. And meanwhile, there are some other artists that are also doing, they are doing more. So I think the focus should also be on some of the other artists that are in countries that are underrepresented, and not necessarily focus on the ones that we know and we see all the time. Thank you.
Oui, ce qu'elle dit,
My internet's been unstable.
Oh, okay. No, go on. Yeah.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I mean, my internet's been unstable, so I apologize for that. But the thing to mind, not trying to decide that one thing is better than another, it's that we have to recognize where we have gaps. And so it's not that we should not have collective exhibitions, but they should not be at the expense of making sure that they're monographic exhibitions, and that these monographic exhibitions look back as well. I mean, I think that there has been a shift where we've seen in recent years, Ongechi Mutu, Lynette, exhibition currently in about 6. So, you know, these shows are starting to have the most compelling artists who are on the international scene today, but there's not enough shows that are looking back at important women or recognizing women who have perhaps committed to creating extraordinary work without the same visibility. And I would actually put Dorothy Amanuke in that category, where I think that she is an amazing artist, but not as many people should.
Du coup, j'ai quelques commentaires, mais c'est vrai que je voulais juste dire que ce qu'a dit Bernard sur la question de mettre aussi en relation des artistes de différentes générations et voilà, de différents territoires aussi, voilà, culturels, géographiques, est aussi extrêmement importante. Donc, j'ai quelques commentaires et questions. Donc, il y a Hafida Difolco qui dit The collective exhibition documents a personal work. Et il y a une personne du coup qui souhaite rester anonyme. The lack of representation of BIPOC within the institution walls have a direct impact on their presence within the exposition space. We can assume that the lack of presentation or misrepresentation given to Black women artists, Black artists in general for that matter, throughout history is due to the fact that historically museums and curatorial practices have excluded them from their structural decision-making. Shouldn't we also examine the issues of who tells the stories? Shouldn't we have more Black women sitting at the director's table, leading the director's table, curating their own stories? This might be perhaps an issue more relevant from the point of view of European and American society. Plus de voix diverses pour raconter les histoires permettra d'avoir plus de différents récits et d'équilibrer en fait aussi et d'enrichir les points de vue et les perspectives. Ça, c'est absolument certain. Yes, Alice?
I think yeah, thank you. I agree with whoever wrote that to a great extent, because there's a saying, I worked on a presentation some time back, and there was a quote that I began it with, that until the lion tells his story, the tale of the hunt would always glorify the hunter. So when we look at things from that perspective and consider the fact that our stories have constantly been told by people who are not here, people who are not involved in our lives, it makes it difficult for what we are doing to be projected. And this is not happening only in the art scene, but then it cuts across almost every facet of our lives. So I think it's important that we take part in the decision-making that involves us. We also tell our stories from our perspective, and that is going to help project African arts to where we want to see it. Thank you.
Merci infiniment pour ces échanges, pour ces discussions et pour aussi ces pistes de travail. Et voilà, juste un immense merci. C'était un plaisir voilà, de découvrir vos recherches et j'espère que nous aurons l'occasion d'échanger à nouveau. Mais sans être peut-être dépendant de connexion Wi-Fi cette fois. Et un grand merci et un grand bravo à toute l'équipe d'OR et Anaïs pour une superbe organisation. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup Sonia pour cette conclusion, et merci à tous nos panélistes du jour. C'est assez émouvant de conclure et de se rendre compte qu'on est finalement arrivé au terme de ces 4 journées qui ont vraiment été passionnantes et intenses en échange et en réflexion. Et je pense qu'on a énormément appris sur les artistes femmes africaines, la manière dont l'histoire de l'art a pu les négliger, les discriminer en raison de leur genre, parfois de leurs techniques employées ou encore de leurs conditions féminines qu'elles ont proposées dans leurs œuvres. Aujourd'hui, avec cette dernière session, on a vu en quoi les institutions du monde de l'art sont responsables de ces manquements, mais aussi le rôle qu'elles ont à jouer dans l'écriture de récits plus inclusifs. Donc, je remercie, et mes remerciements vont être longs, alors j'ai donné tous les noms aux interprètes pour être sûr qu'ils me suivent. Mais je remercie évidemment d'abord les panélistes pour la générosité de leur savoir et tous ces enseignements qu'elles nous ont avant tout partagés. Je veux les citer dans l'ordre chronologique de ces 4 journées. Sule Ahmed James, Nancy Dantas, Julia Rensing, Nontobeko Ntombela, Gladys Kalicini, Martha Kazungu, Ruth Bellinga, Nadira Lagoun, Rachida Triki, Mahatazi, Felicia Nietzsche, Portia Maladje, Sena Mokudzeto, Alice Korkor Rebeake, Dorothy Akpene Amenuke, Bernard Rakoy-Jackson, Perrine Laytrop, avec Andy Dike, Amandine Nana et Karen Milbourne, qui a conclu quelque part ce colloque. Grâce à vous, nous avons pu plonger dans des scènes artistiques de très nombreux pays du continent, sans pouvoir être exhaustive en 4 jours, évidemment. On allait du Nigeria à l'Afrique du Sud, en passant par le Maroc, le Ghana, l'Algérie, l'Ouganda, la République démocratique du Congo, le Cameroun, la Zambie, la Tunisie, le Zimbabwe, j'en oublie sûrement, et le tout évidemment dans une vision panafricaine et une perspective africaine du monde. Je remercie nos présidentes de séance pour la modération de ces sessions, Nkoulé Mabasso, Nadine Noupatin, Gaëlle Beaujean et Sonia Recassens. Je remercie évidemment notre comité scientifique, dont certains membres sont intervenus lors de ce colloque. Eva Barois de Cavel, Nadira Lagoun, Pejula Iwola, Nkoulé Mabasso, Nontobeko Ntombela, Karen Milbourne, Chika Okeke Agulu, Sena Mokudzeto, Fatou Sarso et Rachida Triki. Et oui, la liste est longue. Et bien sûr, Ngonefal, qui était à la fois conspiratrice initiale dans ce projet, membre du comité scientifique, soutien sans faille avec l'exigence, la ténacité, et plus de lumière, et l'engagement qu'on lui connaît. Je tiens à la remercier vraiment, vraiment très sincèrement ici pour la force avec laquelle elle porte ses convictions. Et je salue également le travail de ses équipes à l'Institut français, et en premier lieu Laura Davy, et bien sûr mes merveilleuses collègues à EOR, puisque tout ça est un travail d'équipe, comme vous l'avez déjà remarqué. Fanny Verdier, Mathilda Tacheska, Marie Chenel, Clotilde Nodo, Manuela Danescu et surtout Justine Lacombe et Rose Ledlin-Grelzamer qui ont porté ce projet au quotidien à mes côtés. Je remercie évidemment Camille Morino, cofondatrice et directrice de WER, pour avoir fait des artistes femmes africaines une priorité dans nos recherches chez WER et notre ouverture scientifique à l'international. Merci également à nos partenaires institutionnels, Claire Barbillon, directrice de l'école du Louvre, ainsi que Françoise Blanc, responsable des colloques et des éditions, avec qui nous espérons publier les actes de ce colloque. Donc, merci encore à toutes les personnes que je viens de citer pour tout ce que vous nous avez appris pour faire avancer WER aussi dans ses missions et son ouverture. C'est une aventure assez émouvante. Évidemment, j'aurais aimé que l'on puisse se réunir en présentiel, comme on dit maintenant, et poursuivre ces débats autour d'un verre. Et je suis sûre qu'on aura d'autres opportunités, parce que j'espère vraiment qu'il s'agit là, avec ce colloque, du début d'un long chantier. J'espère vivement qu'on aura la possibilité d'organiser ensemble un second colloque, et en tout cas de maintenir cet espace de dialogue que nous avons ouvert grâce à Ngonefal. Je vous invite aussi à consulter sur notre site les notices biographiques que l'on a publiées avec le comité scientifique, et un certain nombre d'articles de recherche qui ont été évoqués ces derniers jours pendant le colloque. Nous allons aussi également publier très prochainement un compte-rendu de l'exposition The Power of My Hand, qui est actuellement au Musée d'Art moderne de la ville de Paris, aussi dans le cadre de la saison Africa 2020, et dont les commissaires sont Odile Burluro et Susanna Sousa. Vous pourrez bien sûr retrouver le colloque en ligne prochainement, et d'ici quelques mois dans l'ouvrage sur lequel nous allons travailler dès la semaine prochaine. Voilà pour ces remerciements, pour cette conclusion. Merci encore. Et je vous souhaite un excellent week-end et je vous dis à bientôt en ligne ou dans la vraie vie. Merci encore à toutes et à tous pour ces 4 jours passionnants.